My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34. Coming home for the holidays, I found my grandmother alone on the freezing floor. My parents were living it up in Florida with my sister. Mom's text cut like a knife. Don't bother us. I wrapped her fragile body in my coat and carried her out without a word. They had always treated me like trash, just the family cook. The pathetic, disposable servant who served plates while my sister was the golden child they bragged about. Grandma's container sat completely empty in a fridge stuffed with steaks and wine for their perfect holiday. 3 days later, they came home to a deathly silent house and found Grandma's room completely empty, except for my lawyer's card sitting on the kitchen counter. Mom read the name and let out a piercing scream, and this was only the beginning. If you stay with me to the end, you'll understand exactly why she screamed, and why I never raised my voice once. But to understand that scream, you have to go back to the afternoon I turned my key in that door. It was the 23rd of December. I'd driven 3 hours with a cooler in the back seat. Good butter, the bones for stock, the soup my grandmother asked for every winter of my life. I am a cook. It's the one thing my family agreed I was good for, and even that they said like an insult. Claire's bringing the food, my mother would announce at the door, the way you'd say the caterer had arrived. Not a granddaughter, a service. I'd stopped expecting them to see it any other way a long time ago. You learn, in a family like mine, to take your worth in the places it's actually wanted. And the place mine was wanted was a chair beside an old woman who thought my cooking was the finest thing in the world. So I drove 3 hours, several times a month, for years. For her. Never for them. The porch light was off. That was the first wrong thing. Ruth never let the porch go dark. She said a dark porch told the street nobody was home. I knocked. Nothing. I let myself in. The house was cold the way a house gets when the heat has been off for more than a day. Not chilly, cold with intention. My breath caught a little in the front hall, and I called out the way I always did. Grandma? It's Claire. I brought the good butter. The quiet that came back wasn't the quiet of an empty house. It was heavier than that. I knew the difference before I could have told you why. I set the cooler down. There was a stack of mail on the kitchen table, and underneath it, the corner of something white. A card, face down. I didn't pick it up. I'd remember that card later, and I'd hate myself for walking past it. But right then, something pulled me toward the living room, and that's where I found her. My grandmother was on the floor. Time did a strange thing. It stretched. I remember the exact pattern of the rug, the way her cardigan had ridden up. One slipper gone. She was on her side near the cold radiator, and she was so small. Ruth had never been small. Ruth filled rooms. I was on my knees before I decided to kneel. I've got you. Don't talk. Just let me look at you. Her lips were cracked white at the corners. The skin on the back of her hand, when I pinched it, stood up in a little tent and stayed there. Dehydration. The kind you learn to read when you've spent years feeding people who can't feed themselves. Her pulse was fast and thin under my fingers. Her eyes found me, swam, found me again. Claire, she said. It came out like paper. I'm here. I'm right here. Her fingers curled into my sleeve and held. Not a grab. A small, exhausted holding on, like she'd been waiting and had finally been allowed to stop. She was wearing her Sunday blouse. The lavender one. And it took me a second, kneeling there, to understand what that meant. That this was the blouse she'd had on the last time anyone bothered to dress her, and that had been days ago. She had been on this floor, or near it, longer than a person should be alone. There was a glass on the side table, tipped on its side, a dried ring where water had been and then wasn't. She had tried to reach it. At some point, my grandmother had tried to take care of herself, the way she'd taken care of every one of us for 60 years, and she hadn't been able to, and no one had come. I have cooked for sick people, for old people, for people who were dying and didn't want anyone to fuss. I know what a body looks like when it has been quietly going without. I know it better than I know almost anything else in this world. And I knelt there on my grandmother's rug, and I read every sign on her, the way I'd read a ticket on a busy night, fast and certain, and every single one of them said the same thing, and the thing was that she had been left. I didn't let myself feel it yet. There wasn't room. Feeling it would have been a kind of luxury, and luxuries are for people who aren't holding someone's head up off a cold floor. I needed water into her, slow, and I needed to know how bad it was. So I made myself stand, and I went to the kitchen. I opened the refrigerator to find something she could keep down. It was full. Steaks, 2 of them, marbled and expensive, still on the foam tray with the price sticker. A bottle of white wine, a second one. A wheel of brie. Little jars of the olives my mother liked. Holiday food. Florida was coming back to this food. A fridge stocked for people who mattered. And on the second shelf, pushed to the back, 1 container. Clear plastic. A strip of masking tape across the lid. And on the tape, 1 word in my mother's handwriting. Mom. I picked it up. It was empty, not eaten from empty. Washed, rinsed clean and dried and put back, like a thing returned to a shelf to wait for a use that was never coming. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it took me weeks to understand the full cruelty of it. You don't write a name on a container and leave it empty by accident. To label that lid Mom, you had to be thinking of her, specifically her, while you stocked everyone else's holiday into that refrigerator. And then you had to decide that the one with her name on it would stay empty. That was a choice somebody made with her name, right there under their pen. I stood there holding it in a refrigerator full of food for everybody who mattered, and something in my chest went very quiet and very cold. Not loud. The opposite of loud. I've noticed that the worst feelings of my life have never once been loud. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I'd texted my mother from my knees in the living room, one-handed, while my other hand held the back of Ruth's head. Mom, Grandma is on the floor. She's badly dehydrated. How long has she been alone? Call me. The reply took 20 minutes. 20 minutes, while I got a few sips of water past my grandmother's lips and counted her breaths. When it came, it was 4 lines on a screen that lit up the dim kitchen. We're in Florida till the 26th. Vanessa booked it months ago. She does this for attention, Claire. Don't bother us. I read it twice. The screen reflected on the dark window, and past my own face, I could see the empty container still sitting on the counter where I'd set it down. I called her. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, her bright company voice telling me to leave a message. I didn't leave one. I put the phone face down on the counter, and I didn't pick it up again. Some silences answer the question for you. I had my answer. I stopped asking. I went back to my grandmother, and I made a decision with my hands before I made it with my head. I wasn't leaving her in that house. I understand now that this was the first real choice I'd made in my whole life that put me directly against my family. For 34 years, I'd absorbed, accommodated, smoothed things over, made myself small enough to fit in the gaps they left for me. And kneeling on that cold floor, I felt all of that just stop. Not in anger, in something quieter and far more permanent. Whatever this family was, whatever they had decided, I was taking her out of it. That was no longer a question I was going to ask anyone's permission to answer. I took off my coat, the heavy wool one, still carrying the smell of the kitchen I'd driven from, onions and bay leaf in the weave. And I worked it around her shoulders, her arms, tucked it under her like a sling. She weighed almost nothing. That's the detail my body won't let go of. I have carried sacks of flour that fought me harder than my grandmother did. We're not staying here, I told her. You're coming with me. She didn't argue. She turned her face into my shoulder. I carried her out into the cold, down the dark porch steps, to my car. I belted her into the passenger seat the way you'd belt a child, careful of the shoulder strap against her collarbone. And that's when I saw it. Reaching across to click the buckle, the sleeve of my coat fell back from her wrist, and on the thin skin there were marks. 4 of them in a row, and 1 on the other side. The shape your hand makes when you grip something too hard and it doesn't want to be gripped. Fingerprints. I closed the door very gently. I walked around to the driver's side. I sat down and I put both hands on the wheel, and for about 3 seconds, I didn't drive anywhere at all. Then I did. The emergency room at that hour, 2 nights before Christmas, was half empty and too bright. I gave them everything in the flat. Fast voice I use on a bad night on the line when panicking would only slow the food down. She's 86. She's lost maybe 20 pounds since summer. Skin tense, mucous membranes are dry. She's tachycardic. She wasn't eating. Someone wasn't feeding her. The triage nurse looked up from her screen, and something shifted in her face. The way people look at a cook when the cook turns out to know the words. People expect a certain kind of language from a woman in kitchen clogs with stock under her fingernails. They don't expect tachycardic. They don't expect skin tense. I watched her recalculate who I was, and then she started moving faster, and that was all I wanted. I didn't need her to respect me. I needed her to hurry. They got a line in, they got fluids running. They wheeled her back, and I walked beside the bed with my hand on the rail, because Ruth's eyes kept looking for me. And as long as she was looking for me, I was going to make sure she found me. A nurse was cutting the lavender blouse away from her shoulder to place the leads. She paused over Ruth's wrist, over the marks, and she didn't make it a big thing. She just asked, quiet, not writing yet, and the bruising on her wrist, "Do you know how that happened?" "No," I said. "I just found her." It was the truth, but it saddened me wrong, because I was beginning to understand that "I just found her" was a sentence that should have belonged to a stranger, not to family. They asked me to sign the consent forms, and I signed them in the only box I thought I had any right to: granddaughter. It didn't occur to me to ask whether I was anything more than that. Why would it? I was the one nobody called. I had spent my whole life being the last to know things in this family, and I had no reason, standing under those white lights with a pen in my hand, to think this was any different. I would learn, 2 days later, that it was. But that's getting ahead of myself. The blood work came back, while the monitors beeped their steady proof that she was still here. A doctor came in, Dr. Pham, lanyard, careful hands, the kind of tired that comes from caring on purpose. She read the screen, and then she read me. "Her albumin is 2.1, she said. "Do you know what that tells me?" "Protein," I said. "Long term, not one bad week. Not one bad week." She set the tablet down. "This is months, Ms. Bennett. A body doesn't get here in a few days. Someone has been letting this happen for a long time." She let that settle, gently, the way you set a hot pan down so it doesn't clatter. "Who's been caring for her?" I opened my mouth to say, her daughter, my mother, the woman whose handwriting was on an empty container, and I stopped. Because the honest answer and the official answer had just split into 2 different things, and I didn't yet know which one I was allowed to say out loud. "I'm not sure anymore," I said. Dr. Pham looked at me for a moment longer than the question needed. Then she nodded once, like a woman filing something away, and she made a note. By 3 in the morning they had Ruth stable and sleeping, and I was sitting in the orange light of the corridor in a chair that wanted me to leave. I had already stopped calling my parents. I'd called once, in the car, and that was the whole of it. People think the hard part is the screaming match. It isn't. The hard part is the moment you understand there's no one on the other end to scream at, that you have been managing this family's emergencies alone for so long that the silence on the line is just the sound of something you already knew. So I sat. I didn't cry. I watched the clock on the wall click from 3:00 to 3:01, and I let myself be tired in a way I hadn't allowed since I'd turned my key in that door. And in the quiet, the old arithmetic ran itself, the way it always did when I was too tired to stop it. I thought about every time I'd been the one to drive out. Every birthday I'd cooked while Vanessa arrived late and left early and was praised for both. Every family emergency that had somehow become mine to manage, while everyone else stayed comfortable. I'd told myself for years that this was just my role, that some people are the ones who show up, and some people are the ones who get celebrated, and that there was no use being bitter about which one you were. But sitting in that orange light, I finally understood something I'd been too well trained to see. It wasn't that I'd been given the smaller part. It was that they'd needed someone to give it to. A family like mine runs on having one person you can overlook. One person whose love you can spend freely, because you're sure they'll never stop giving it. I had been that person my whole life, and the bill for it was lying in a hospital bed 20 feet away, 86 years old and down to skin. A shape came down the hall toward me, and for one stupid, hopeful second, my body thought family. It wasn't. It was the night nurse. Older, soft-shoed, the kind who's seen every version of this hallway. She didn't ask me how I was holding up. She did something better. She set a paper cup of coffee on the arm of my chair, warm, and she went into Ruth's room, and I watched through the glass as she drew a second blanket up over my grandmother's shoulders and tucked it and lifted her head to settle the pillow and smoothed the hair back from her face. Small things, the things you do for someone who is yours. When she came back out, she stopped beside me. "You got her here in time," she said. "Not everybody does." I held the warm cup and couldn't answer for a second. There was a card in her coat pocket, the nurse added, already moving on to her next room. "A lawyer's. Fell out when we hung the coat up. I left it on the table by her bed for you." A lawyer's card in my grandmother's pocket. I thought about the white corner under the mail on her kitchen table, the thing I'd walked past. I didn't go look at it yet. Not yet. Near dawn, Ruth surfaced. Her eyes opened and tracked the ceiling, then the window going gray, then me, clearer than before. The fluids had done their slow work. I'd brought a thermos up from the cooler in my car, the soup still warm enough. I'd made it 2 days ago in my own kitchen, not knowing. I lifted a spoonful to her lips, and she took it, swallowed, and a little color came back into her, like a flame steadying. She looked at me. She knew me completely. "Claire," she said, "you came." Her voice was still thin, but it was hers. "Tastes like you're home." I had to look at the floor for a moment. Then I gave her another spoonful and another, slow, the way you feed someone you intend to keep. Down the hall, I knew, there was a chart with a doctor's careful note in it, and a question I still couldn't answer. Why was I the only one here? I didn't have the answer. But the card in her coat pocket did. In the morning, I read the name on the card. Halloway Elder Law, not a real estate office, not the closing attorney I'd half assumed, the kind a family hires to sell a house out from under an old woman. Elder Law, the kind of lawyer a person goes to quietly, on their own, when they've decided to protect something. I stepped into the hallway and I called the number. A man answered himself, no receptionist, early as it was. "You don't know me," I said. "My name is Claire Bennett. You have a card that was in my grandmother's coat. Ruth Bennett." There was a pause on the line, not a confused pause. The pause of a man who has been waiting for a particular call and has just heard it arrive. "Claire," he said, "she told me you'd be the one to call." His name was Halloway, and he'd known my grandmother for the better part of a year, and what he told me rearranged the floor under my feet. "8 months ago," he said, "your grandmother came to me on her own. She set up a revocable living trust. She put the house into it, her accounts, and a durable power of attorney, both financial and medical. He paused so I could keep up. She named a successor trustee, the person who takes over the moment she can no longer manage her own affairs, the person who would also make her medical decisions if it came to that. Another pause. That person is you, Claire. Not your mother. You. I stood in the hospital corridor and held the wall. And then it hit me, all at once, what I had been doing for the last 12 hours. The consent forms, the box I'd signed as granddaughter. Small and unsure, because I thought that was all I was. I had been her legal voice since April. The whole night I'd spent believing I had no standing in this family, no right to so much as raise mine. I had quietly, secretly, been the one she chose to speak for her. She just hadn't told me. She'd let me find it out, exactly like this, on a hospital phone with her sleeping 20 feet away. April 15th, he said. It's all properly executed. There's video of the signing. She answered every question. What day it was, what she owned, who her family was, what she wanted. She was, in the legal sense and every other sense, completely herself that day. 8 months, while I drove 3 hours every few weeks and got told not to bother them, while they called me the cook, the help, the failure. My grandmother had quietly walked into a lawyer's office, sat down across from a stranger, and put her entire life, her house, her money, her own body's care, into the hands of the granddaughter everyone else had written off. And she had never said a word about it, not a hint. She'd carried that secret through every holiday dinner where they seated me below the salt, knowing the whole time what she'd done, knowing who she'd chosen. I had to put my hand flat against the cool wall of that corridor and just breathe for a second. There's also a letter, Holloway said, gentler now. She wrote it that same day. She asked me to give it to you, but only if you came back for her. Only if you were the one who showed up. A beat. You showed up. I asked him the question that was burning a hole in me. Why me? Vanessa's the... Everyone always said Vanessa, the successful one. Why not her? Why not my mother? I heard paper. He was unfolding something. She anticipated you'd ask. She left me a few lines to read you, if you did. He cleared his throat, and then it wasn't his voice anymore. It was hers, coming down the line in a stranger's mouth. The others visit. You feed me. There is a difference, Claire, and I am old enough to know it. I saw what was coming a long time ago. That is why I made sure it would be you. I closed my eyes, and there it was. A thing I hadn't thought about in years, surfacing whole. Every holiday table of my childhood, my grandmother saving the chair beside her. Always. The good chair, the one nobody fought for because it was understood to be mine. While they put Vanessa at the head of the table and toasted her, Ruth quietly kept the seat next to her empty until I sat down in it. I'd thought it was nothing. A habit. It wasn't a habit. It was a verdict she'd been handing down my whole life, and I was only now reading it. Holloway let me have the silence. Then he spoiled it, the way it needed to be spoiled. There's a problem, Claire. Money's moving out of her accounts, and there's a wire scheduled for the 29th. Tell me, I said. Regular transfers, going back months, out of your grandmother's accounts to your sister, Vanessa. He was reading now, flat and clean. And one more. Scheduled, automated, set to execute on December 29th. It's large, several times the size of the others. He let me hear what that meant. It's a sweep, Claire. Somebody's emptying the well before they close the lid. After it goes through, that money's gone. Wires don't come back. I thought about the brie and the wine, the 2 steaks. A house sold out from under the woman who built it. There's a sale too, isn't there? I said. The house is listed, it's in escrow, but that closing isn't for weeks. That's the slow problem, and we can stop it, because you're the trustee, and they have no authority to sell. The wire is the fast problem. As successor trustee, you can freeze it, but it executes in days. A pause. They'll fight you. So before we move, I need to understand something. I need to know how far they were willing to go to set this up. I looked through the glass at my grandmother, sleeping, the second blanket the night nurse had given her rising and falling. Then I'll find out, I said. Before I went, I read her letter, sitting in the chair by her bed while the morning came up gray in the window. Her handwriting had a tremor in it that the woman from my childhood never had. That tremor undid me more than any of it. I ran my thumb over the dent her pen had pressed into the paper. I'm not going to give you all of it. Some of it was only for me, but there was a line in the middle, and it's the line I carried into every room after that. Don't let them put a price on me, Claire. You're the only one who ever saw a person where they saw a burden. I folded the letter. I put it in my breast pocket, over the place where you feel things. She had seen this coming 8 months ago. Now I had to find out exactly how far they'd gone, and the house, I knew, would tell me. Houses always do. Have you ever had this? The moment you realize the people who were supposed to love you had been planning around you the whole time? If you have, you already know what I walked back into that house to find. Tell me in the comments where you were when you understood it. I read them. I see you. I went back to the house the next afternoon. Legally. I was the trustee now. That floor under my feet was mine to stand on. In a way, it had never been before. I stood in the front hall and I made myself look at the place the way I'd look at a kitchen on an inspection. Not as a granddaughter, but as someone reading a room for what really happened in it. The empty container with Imam on the lid I'd brought back in a paper bag. Evidence, though I hadn't let myself use that word yet. I started with the front door, because at the front door, up under the eave, my grandmother's video doorbell sat with its little light pulsing. Still recording, still backing up to her account in the cloud, the account she'd set up years ago and made me help her with because she didn't trust herself with the password. She'd made me the keeper of that password. Of course she had. I logged in. The footage went back weeks. I scrolled, and the house gave up its days one clip at a time. December 21st. My mother, in a good coat, carrying a foil-covered tray to her car. Going to Florida, the clip had audio. As she pulled the door shut behind her, she said something over her shoulder to my father, easy as weather. She'll be fine. She barely eats anyway. December 22nd. My parents again, arms full of grocery bags going in. The steaks, the wine, I'd bet anything, and coming back out 20 minutes later with the bags empty and their hands free. Not once, in any clip, did anyone carry anything to my grandmother. They stocked that refrigerator like they were stocking a vacation rental. For themselves. Around her. I sat on the cold front step with the phone in my hand and watched my family walk past their own mother for weeks, and I did not cry. I have wondered since why I didn't. I think it's because crying is for things you don't understand yet, and I was beginning to understand everything. I scrolled back further, and in an older clip, from November, there was a third figure on that porch. Vanessa. The golden child, carrying a thick envelope. I went inside and I opened my grandmother's accounts because now I had the right to. I'm a cook, not a banker, but a cook reads a prep list the way an accountant reads a ledger. You see at a glance what's missing, what doesn't add up, what was taken when no one was looking, and the ledger in front of me added up to one ugly thing. The line repeated, month after month, in the cold language of a bank. Transfer to V. Bennett, 4,200 TRs, recurring, over and over, back through the summer. And then, at the bottom, waiting. Scheduled, Deck 29, wire transfer, V. Bennett. The scheduled one wasn't 4,000. It was the kind of number that has a lot of zeros and empties a person's life in a single afternoon. The final sweep. One day after my parents flew home, before anyone they didn't control could notice. I wrote the date on the back of my hand with a kitchen pencil. The 29th, 4 days. It wasn't an accident. Accidents don't get scheduled. That night, in the quiet of the house that was now legally mine to sit in, I did the thing that hurt the most. I scrolled back through my own old texts. There used to be a time, years ago, before they cut me out of her care, when feeding Ruth was allowed to be my job. When I'd cook for her and report back to the family group like it was something to be proud of. I found them. The timestamps were more than a year old. There were dozens. Grandma ate the whole bowl today. She asked for seconds, made her the chicken and rice. She finished it and told me I seasoned better than her own mother did. Highest praise. She's up 2 pounds since I started bringing meals. The doctor's happy. I scrolled and they kept coming, a whole archive of a time when caring for my grandmother had been allowed to be my job. Before my mother decided it should be hers, before we'll handle Mom now, Claire turned out to mean this. There was a photo, too, that stopped me cold. Ruth at her own kitchen table, a bowl in front of her, mid-laugh, one hand up, like she was waving off a compliment. Round-cheeked, alive. I'd sent it to the family thread with 3 exclamation points, and nobody had even reacted to it. I read them all in the dark, and my hands did shake then. Just a little. That's the body channel. That's allowed. That's not the same as falling apart. Because every one of those messages was a photograph of my grandmother thriving, fed, gaining, laughing about seasoning. And every single one of them was now also something else. Proof. Proof that when someone fed her, she lived. Proof of exactly what had been taken from her, and roughly when, and by whose hand it stopped. The cook's texts, the disposable one's texts. Turns out the servant had been keeping receipts for years and never knew it. There was a knock at the door, soft the next morning, and it was the neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez from the Blue House, who'd lived beside my grandmother for 30 years. She had a covered dish in her hands. She held it out to me before she said anything, still warm, and there was a piece of paper tucked under the foil with 3 words on it, in careful cursive. For the one who came back. It's the kindness that gets you when you've gone a long time without expecting any. I'd grown used to the cruelty by then. I had no defenses left at all against a warm dish from a woman who owed me nothing, and I almost lost it, right there on the porch. I've been worried a long time, Mrs. Alvarez said, stepping into the hall when I waved her in. I didn't know who to tell. They'd say I was a nosy old woman. She set her purse on the table, and from it she took a small spiral notebook, the kind you'd keep by a phone. So I wrote it down instead. Every time I thought the ambulance should come, and it didn't. Every time I saw her at the window, and nobody'd raised the blinds for her. She put the notebook in my hands. I kept hoping somebody would finally ask. I turned the little pages. Dates, times. No lights 3 days. Saw R at window, looked thin. Daughter's car gone again. Knocked, no answer, heard nothing. Left a plate on the porch, still there in the morning, untouched. Months of a stranger's quiet vigil, more faithful than her own blood. This woman had left food on my grandmother's doorstep, and it had sat there in the cold, untouched, because the woman it was meant for couldn't get herself to the door. A plate of warm food 3 feet from her, and she couldn't reach it, the same way she couldn't reach the glass of water on her own side table, while her own daughter packed steaks into the refrigerator and flew to Florida. I had to set the notebook down on the table for a second and press the back of my wrist against my mouth. There were papers, too, Mrs. Alvarez said at the door, almost as an afterthought that wasn't an afterthought at all. A man came to notarize something, I think. He had the little stamp. It was the week your grandmother couldn't even stand up on her own. She frowned. Funny week to be signing things. I sat with all of it spread on my grandmother's kitchen table. The doorbell footage, the bank lines, my own old texts, Mrs. Alvarez's notebook, and the shape of it finally stood up and looked back at me. This was never only about money. Money was the easy part to understand. They needed her gone in a particular way. Not dead, erased. They needed a piece of paper that said, Ruth Bennett couldn't think for herself, couldn't be trusted to know her own mind, so they could move her money and sell her house and call it mercy. They needed to make her, in the eyes of the law, nobody. Starving her wasn't neglect, it was the method. A body that can't stand up, can't argue. A woman too weak to eat looks, on paper, like a woman who's lost her mind. I said it out loud to the empty kitchen, just to hear how true it was. They didn't just want the house, they needed her to count as nobody. And somewhere out there was the document they'd built to do it. A paper that said my grandmother had agreed to all of it, of her own free will. I brought everything to Holloway. His office was small and lined with books, and he cleared the desk so I could lay it out. The screenshots, the bank statements, Mrs. Alvarez's notebook open to the marked pages. He went through it slowly, the way Dr. Pham had read the blood work, a professional reading the size of a wound. Then I put down the last thing, the document my parents had filed to start the sale, the one Holloway had pulled from the listing paperwork. Across the top it read, Capacity Assessment and Durable Power of Attorney. This, Holloway said, tapping it, is what they plan to waive at the closing table. It says your grandmother was evaluated, found competent, and voluntarily granted power of attorney. He looked up at me over his glasses. They have no idea she already signed everything to you 8 months ago. They think they're the heirs. They think this is clean. He turned the page to the signature block and the notary stamp. So let's see who put their seal on it. He went still. He pulled a second sheet from his drawer, a printout from the state's registry, and laid it beside the document. This notary, he said. He set one fingertip on the stamp and the other on a line in the registry. His commission expired 2 years ago. He hasn't been a notary since. He looked up. A dead commission can't certify a living signature, Claire. This stamp is worthless, which makes this entire document worthless. It would never survive the first 10 minutes of a hearing. I looked at the stamp, the thing they'd built their whole quiet theft on, a fake seal from a man who'd had no power to seal anything. Who would use an expired notary? I said. Wouldn't a real lawyer check? Someone who couldn't risk a real one asking questions about an old woman who couldn't sit up. He set the registry down. Someone who reached for a man she already knew. A favor, not a professional. He held my eyes. The person who arranged him is named on the cover letter. Your sister, Vanessa. A pause. This stopped being a family disagreement the moment that stamp went down. Forging a document to seize an incapacitated person's estate isn't something a lawyer's letter handles quietly anymore. This is a crime, Claire. We have to report it. And not just to me. It took me an afternoon to trace the rest, and the rest told a story I almost felt sorry for until I remembered the empty container. Vanessa, the one they bragged about, the golden child, the success, was drowning. The business everyone toasted at the head of the table was months from collapse. And when she went looking for a lifeboat, she found one. An 86-year-old woman with a paid-off house and a lifetime of savings, and parents who would help her bail it out because helping Vanessa was the only religion that family ever really practiced. Grandma's accounts were the lifeboat. Grandma herself was just in the way. There were emails, a receipt with the notary's name on it, a thread where my mother asked, in writing, how soon can the house close? V needs it before the quarter. Not is Mom okay? Not who's feeding her. How soon can we sell the house? There it was, the whole moral weather of my childhood, finally in text I could print. We have everything, Holloway said when I brought it back. Now, there's a decision to make about how this happens. I made a call to Adult Protective Services and I sent them everything. The doorbell clips, the photo of the empty container, Mrs. Alvarez's dated notebook, Dr. Pham's findings on the malnutrition, and the photographs the hospital had taken of the grip marks on Ruth's wrist. A caseworker wrote back faster than I expected, 2 days before the holiday week ended. The email was short, and it was the most powerful thing I'd read in days. We've logged your report and opened a formal inquiry into suspected elder neglect. Given the financial findings and the forged instrument, we're coordinating with law enforcement. Case number assigned. The system, for once, was on my grandmother's side. The caseworker had one question, and it changed the shape of what I did next. Will the family be present when they return from Florida? If so, we would like to be there. They were coming home on the 26th. To a house they thought held a helpless old woman and a fake document and a sister too beaten down to fight. I wrote back one word. Yes. I could have frozen the wire and ended it from a distance. As trustee, one phone call to the bank put a hold on the 29th. I made that call. I made it from my grandmother's hospital room by the window while she slept, and the man on the other end said, "The transfer has been placed on hold," in a bored voice that had no idea it was saving an old woman's life. The money was safe, but I didn't want it to end on a phone line. I didn't want a lawyer's letter to arrive in their mailbox in February while they sat in Florida, mildly annoyed, already spinning the story for their friends. Claire overreacted. Claire was always dramatic. You know how she is. I knew exactly how that would go, because I had watched them rewrite the truth my whole life. If they heard it secondhand, they'd survive it. They'd find a version where they were the ones who'd been wronged. I thought about it for a long time, in that chair by her bed. I am not by nature a person who wants a scene. Quiet is my native country, but I understood something that night I'd never let myself act on before. That some truths only land if the person has to stand inside them, in the room, with witnesses, with nowhere to look but at the thing they did. My grandmother had spent 8 months making the truth airtight. The least I could do was make sure it got heard. I wanted it to happen at the table, her table, so I said it. Holloway would come. Dr. Pham agreed to be there on her afternoon off because she said some charts deserve a witness. The caseworker from APS would come, and on my grandmother's kitchen counter, where my mother couldn't possibly miss it, I left 2 things: a thick envelope with the original trust inside, and on top of it, face up this time, Holloway's card. The same kind of card I'd walked past on my way in 3 days before. The one I'd hated myself for not seeing. This time, it lay face up, in the light, waiting for them. A dead notary's stamp can't certify a living woman's signature. I'd learned that the hard way. Now, they were going to. There were 3 days left. I left the kitchen light on, and I waited. They came home on the 26th, a little after 4, tan and loud and trailing wheeled suitcases up the walk. I was sitting in the kitchen. I heard the front door, my mother's voice already complaining about the drive, my father's lower rumble, Vanessa's laugh. Then the laugh stopped. I heard them go down the hall to my grandmother's room, the way you go to check on something you've stopped really looking at. I heard the door open. And then the silence. The deathly silence I'd promised you at the very beginning. The bed was stripped and made. Her things were gone. The room was empty. The window cracked to air it out, the curtain moving a little in the cold. Where is she? My mother's voice, climbing. Footsteps, fast now, coming toward the kitchen. Claire, what did you do? She came around the corner and stopped when she saw me sitting at the table, and then she saw the counter. She picked up the card first. I watched her read it, Holloway Elder Law. I watched her face try 3 different expressions and fail at all of them. Then she opened the envelope, and she pulled out the trust, and her eyes went down the first page. I'll tell you what I learned, watching my mother in that moment. A person doesn't scream like that out of anger. Anger is loud, but it's full of itself. It has somewhere to go. This was different. This was the sound a person makes when the floor they've been standing on turns out to have never been there. When they understand, all at once, that they bet everything on a hand they were never holding. No, she said. No, this isn't. She can't have And then she screamed. One long, piercing note, the exact sound from the beginning of this story, in the exact kitchen, and now you know what it was made of. Not rage, comprehension. Behind her, my father had gone gray. Vanessa stood very still in the doorway, with her tan and her good clothes. There was a knock at the front door. I'd invited it. Holloway came in first, briefcase in hand, then Dr. Pham, in a plain coat, holding a folder. Then the caseworker from APS, with a county lanyard and a calm, unhurried face. My mother spun toward me. "Who are these people? This is private. This is family business?" "Sit down, Mom," I said. Not loud. I have never once in this story been loud. "You're going to want to be sitting." Holloway set the original trust on the table and turned it so they could read it right side up. "Ruth Bennett executed this living trust on April 15th, he said. "Witnessed, notarized, recorded. It places her home and her accounts under the control of her successor trustee, who is her granddaughter, Claire. There is video of the signing in which Mrs. Bennett is fully competent." He let that land. "The house is not yours to sell. It never was. The sale is dead." My mother's mouth opened. And out came the second move, the one I'd known was coming, because I'd grown up watching her make it, the pivot, the mask sliding from outraged to grieving. "We were trying to protect her," she said, and her eyes went wet on command, the way they always could. "She's not herself. She hasn't been competent in months. We were doing what's best." I slid the second document across the table, the capacity assessment, their paper. "You said she wasn't competent," I said. "Then let's talk about who notarized that." Dr. Pham didn't wait to be asked. She opened her folder and she set one page on the table, face up beside their fraudulent one. "I admitted Ruth Bennett on the 23rd, she said. Quiet, precise, a doctor's voice. "Severe protein malnutrition, albumin of 2.1. Dehydration consistent with prolonged lack of care. This did not happen in a week." She looked once around the table, at my mother, at my father, at Vanessa. It happened over months. Nobody in this room was feeding her. She set down a second page beside the first. A photograph. "And this is her wrist, the night she came in." Her voice didn't change at all, and that was what made it terrible. 5 bruises, 4 on one side, 1 on the other. They're grip marks. The pattern a hand makes, closing around an arm hard enough to bruise the bone of an 86-year-old woman. They were already days old when I admitted her. She let the photograph sit there, in the middle of the table, where no one could not see it. Someone didn't just stop feeding her. At some point, someone put their hand on her and squeezed. I documented it. It's in the record. The kitchen went very quiet. Nobody at that table said a word. But I watched Vanessa's eyes drop to the photograph and then drop further, to her own hands in her lap, and I watched her fold them out of sight under the table, and I did not need anyone to say anything after that. Some answers arrive without a single word being spoken. Holloway picked up their document by one corner, like something unclean. "And the assessment they meant to use," he said, "was notarized by a man whose commission expired 2 years ago." He set down the registry printout next to it. "A dead commission. It certifies nothing. This paper is worthless." He turned to Vanessa, and his voice didn't rise. It just sharpened. "You arranged him. Your name is on the cover letter." The caseworker spoke for the first time, and she spoke to all of them, and she had a quiet kind of authority that filled the room without trying. "I've opened a formal inquiry into elder neglect," she said. "I have the medical records, the photographs of the grip marks, a neighbor's dated log going back months, doorbell footage." She paused, and then she reached into her bag and set one more thing on the table, in an evidence sleeve. The container, clear plastic, masking tape, one word. "There's a container here," she said, with the word Mom written on it in someone's handwriting. It was found empty in a full refrigerator. She looked up, and then she said the part that made my father's hands flatten on the wood. "I want to be clear about where this is. Between the forged instrument, the financial transfers, and the physical findings, this is no longer only my office's matter. I've already been in contact with law enforcement. They will be asking in some detail who wrote that name, and who left it empty, and about the wrist. I watched it go around the table. The container with Mom on the lid, the thing my mother had labeled and emptied and put back on the shelf. My mother couldn't look at it. Vanessa couldn't look at any of it. The financial records came next, the recurring transfers, the scheduled sweep, the email about closing the house before the quarter. Each piece went down on the table like a floorboard pulled up. And then my father made a sound. He had sat down at some point in the chair at the end. Not the head of the table, the end, the place no one fights for. His hands were flat on the wood, and he was the one who broke, because the weak ones always break before the proud ones do. I knew, my father said. My mother said his name, a warning, but he kept going, looking at the table, at the container in its sleeve. God help me, I knew. I saw how thin she was getting. I saw the bruise. I told myself she'd knocked it on the bed rail. I let Diane handle it. I let Vanessa. I told myself it wasn't my... His voice gave out. I knew, and I let it happen. It's the closest thing to an apology I would get from anyone in that family. It wasn't to me. It was to the empty chair where my grandmother used to sit and save the seat beside her. My mother was still standing, still trying to find the version of her face that worked. There wasn't one left. The room had stopped believing her, and a woman like my mother is nothing without a room that believes her. I stood up. I want you to notice that I didn't yell. Not here at the end, where you'd think I'd earned it. I looked at my mother, not Mom now. I looked at Diane. You looked at her and you saw a burden, I said. She looked at me and saw a person. That's the whole difference between us. And it's the reason the house was never yours. Diane had no answer. For the first time in my entire life, my mother had nothing to say. I picked up my grandmother's letter from the table where I'd set it down, and I put it back in my pocket, over my chest, where I'd been carrying it. I didn't stay to watch them leave. I didn't need to. The caseworker had her case. Holloway had the trust. Dr. Pham had her chart. The wire was frozen, the house was safe, and the truth was sitting on the table in a stack anyone could read. She didn't scream because she was angry. She screamed because she finally understood she had lost. I had somewhere better to be. I had someone waiting for me to cook her dinner. A few weeks later, my grandmother sat in the small kitchen of my apartment, wrapped in a blanket while a pot of soup came up to a simmer on my 2-burner stove. She was stronger. Slower than she used to be, and she'd have to be watched, and some days were foggy. But she was eating. She'd gained back 6 pounds. She knew what day it was. She knew exactly who she was, and exactly who I was. She'd taken the spare room, which I'd painted a pale yellow the week before I brought her home, because I remembered her kitchen in the old house had been that color, and she always said yellow rooms made food taste better. I'd moved my cookbooks off the shelf in there to make space for her things, the photographs, the Bible with the soft, cracked spine, the little radio she liked to keep on low. We had a rhythm now. I cooked. She sat at the counter and told me I was using too much salt and not enough, in the same breath, the way she always had. Some afternoon she'd doze off mid-sentence and wake up and finish the thought 20 minutes later like no time had passed. I learned to just be there for the end of the sentence whenever it came. The whole apartment smelled like onions and bay leaf and chicken stock. The smell that had been in the weave of the coat I'd wrapped her in on her own freezing floor. The smell that meant, to both of us, that someone was being taken care of. She lifted her head and breathed it in, and she smiled. It smells like the old house, she said, before they forgot how to be kind. I stirred the pot and didn't trust my voice for a second. On the counter there was a letter that had come that morning from the county. I'll keep the consequences short, because they don't deserve the length the kindness does. The sale of the house collapsed. The trust saw to that. The wire never went through. Vanessa's business went down anyway. And what's attached to her name now isn't the story of a struggling businesswoman. It's an open criminal file with the word forgery in it and a separate line for what those photographs showed. That part isn't mine to carry anymore. It's the district attorney's. My parents standing in the little world they'd performed for their whole lives. The church friends, the country club, the people they'd bragged to about their golden daughter, did not survive the gossip. The family that called me disposable spent the most worth they had on a lie and lost. The letter from APS had a line in it, near the bottom, that I read more than once. I read it standing at my own counter with soup on the stove and my grandmother humming along to her little radio in the yellow room. Findings: substantiated neglect. 2 words. They did what years of my own words never could. They said it was real, and it was not your fault, and you were right to carry her out of that house. From the stove, my grandmother's voice, stronger every day. Come sit. I set 2 plates on the table. I want you to understand what that meant, because the whole story lives in it. My whole life, I was the one who served. I carried the plates and cleared them. I was the cook, the help, the one who stood while everyone else sat. They made it an insult, but I'd learned something, carrying my grandmother out of a freezing house in my own coat, feeding her 1 slow spoonful at a time until the color came back into her face. Serving someone isn't the lowest thing a person can do. It's just another word for seeing them. Really seeing them when no one else bothers to look. So I set down 2 plates, 2 chairs, pulled close. No empty seat saved at the end of a table for a girl they decided didn't matter. And for the first time in my life, my grandmother looked up at me and patted the chair beside her and told me to sit down and eat. I sat. If you've ever been the one they overlooked, the one who showed up anyway, who did the quiet work no one clapped for, I hope you know what my grandmother knew. You were never the disposable one. You were the one who was paying attention, and one day, that turns out to be everything. Thank you for staying until the end. If this reached something in you, tell me about the person in your life who saved you a seat. I'll be reading.